Alrighty again, folks. Old Buster bringing you another story. Name of this one is Makin Time. But you know, our last story we're talking about over in Africa, and I got an old boy that comes here and kind of looks after me. His name is Isaac Nobari Araka. And their culture and what you learn about them is pretty nifty. I've been learning some of their lingo a little bit, and a guy like him is a welcome sight in this country. The man speaks 3 languages, Christian, clean, moral, and he's calm through anything. He doesn't get rattled about nothing, doesn't raise his voice. Just a joy to be around. So I want to put a shout out to old Isaac. I doubt if he ever watches one of these videos, but I'd like to say howdy to anybody that does know him. Alright, we got a new story here called Makin Time. Well, Buster drove up in his and Ford said, "Get on in, we're taking a trip." Well, Jesse told Buster he couldn't just up and leave because he had some things that needed doing. And Buster said, "Yep, you're going." Now, Miss Sarah, Jesse's ma, brung out his and bag and suitcase and kissed Jesse on the cheek and said she and his and pa would see him when they got back. Whoa-wee! Buster opened the door for Jesse and then went around to his side and got in and fired up that old Ford of his. Well, Jesse said, "Now don't that beat all? I had a date tonight with Denise." Well, Buster said they'd stop on the way and tell her that something done come up and he would see her when he got back. Well, heck fire, Captain, y'all ain't a-doing nothing nohow, so you're going to go with me. Now, ain't we got enough of money to take care of a hired hand for chores by now? Well, the captain told Buster they had more than he knowed, but that didn't make no never mind. Buster allowed it did, and they was a-going. They both needed a break and to spend some time together just having some fun. Well, Buster drove on over to Little Rock, stopped for dinner at Crazy Mike's for a bit of something good to eat there. His catfish is to die for. And he's got one of them Grovac machines where, boy, it just makes everything so good. Before they left on out on their trip, they had to get a little bite to eat. Well, Ike had the best dang catfish and burgers and side dishes to go with them in that part of the country. He had some newfangled machine I was telling you about that his pa invented that made his and fish and meat taste so good that when you put a lip lock on a bite, your tongue thought it done died and went to heaven. Well, after dinner, Buster drove over to the Central Flying Service and there sit hired in a new 20-engine Beechcraft. Well, Buster and Hired done bought him a new plane and the captain didn't know a thing about it. Well, Buster told the captain they had a little less in the bank now, but figured he could make it up real soon. Buster stowed their bags and Hired cranked up Belle's sister Queen. Well, Hired told them they had to make a little detour before they got out on the trip. Well, Hired sashayed Queen round about England and headed on out towards Oklahoma. Over at Salisaw, Hired put Queen down on a grass strip and Walter was a-sitting astride that gray of his'n. He'd have been doing some custom work for a feller over there with his and pa and brung Smokey with him. Dubs was going to take Smokey on back with him to the farm when he left out the next day and Walter was going to be gone with the boys. Now the captain said, "Ain't this a surprise?" Well, Buster told the captain that his and mine had been hurting him for a spell, now he needed some relief. Well, Buster said they was going to stop real quick for a nibble or two on a rib up at the road there at the Wild Horse Barbecue before they left out again. Old Herman there, he sure done ribs right, and his and beans just couldn't be beat. Well, Buster took over the flying when they left and the boys was all real comfortable like in the Queen. She held 6+ baggage and Buster and Hired had her pepped up a bit with some special accessories too. Of course, that's the Hired's end of it. Courtesy of Mr. Holmes and Dalton and Devane. Well, Uncle Jeff oversaw the outfitting and the Queen sure was pretty and set real well. The old Buster had to have a little bigger seat in there, you know. Well, Buster set the Queen down in Weatherford, Oklahoma and told the captain he was going to visit with his and Uncle Cecil and Aunt Liz. None of them had seen them since going off to Cayenne, and it was about time. They weren't no spring chickens, you know. They all had a right nice visit for a couple of hours, and then they was off again. Well, next off, Buster landed in a pasture next to Walter's brother Ike's house, place and his and ranch. Now, the captain ain't rode no horse since he was a towel-headed tyke, and he'd been a hankering to do that for quite a spell. Buster told the captain it was no time like the present. Well, Ike met him and his pickup. They all rode on back to the barn where Ike saddled up a real gentle, sure-footed mare for the captain. Well, Ike explained to Jesse what all he had to do in riding the brakes, where they was a-going. Ike called the captain Jesse because he didn't know nothing about how he come about his new moniker. Well, Buster was so dang big he didn't have no horse that would carry him comfortable like, so he stayed behind and checked over the plain and read his book. He always carried him and took a little nap. Walter had a grader ride, so he was right happy like a picket flock. They all took out and come back in the late evening. Well, the captain was a-grinning from ear to ear, even though his legs behind was a mite sore. He told Buster they had to get some horses for sure because it was so much fun. The boys all said thanks for the trail ride and hospitality to Walter's brother Ike, and would see old Ike soon. Well, Ike told Walter to have the folks call to catch up on family, and was a-wondering about the gals and all the courting going on with old Gary and Carla Mae and Mary Gale and Barry Brown. Well, Ike told Walter she had a hair parlor school to finish before she married up that boy, and he needed settling some before he took off with his sister. Well, hired flew the boys to Bethany, Missouri to the Toot Toot restaurant on the Iowa-Missouri line. They was on the Missouri side now of the line. And Buster had eat there many a time and said they had the best fried chicken outside of his grandma's stove he'd ever eat. All kinds of fresh vegetables and desserts galore. They all agreed that the fried chicken was sure enough good as Buster's grandma's chicken they had over there, and they'd surely enough come back. That chicken itself was worth the trip. Well, Buster told him I told you so. Well, the boys ate their fill and got a room for the night. The next morning, the captain said he reckoned they was ready to head on for home. Buster piped up and told Jesse, not on your life, heck, they was just getting started. Well, Hired took them back to the Kearney, Missouri airport, and the boys got a car and went on to the farm of Jesse and Frank James. Now, Buster knowed how much the captain and Walter loved to gom around and piddle and side-fiddle and hunker down for a look-see in every little nook and cranny there was, so Buster let them be for a spell to wander the farm. Well, everybody rightly enjoyed seeing the James place, and then they went on back to Liberty and ate at the Hardware Cafe for some down-home cooking. Buster made up a list of all the famous people that come from Iowa and was letting the captain and Walter pick where they wanted to go. Buster knowed they'd had 8 weeks to fool around, so there wasn't no hurry. And they had a lots of fish to fry, as they say. That is, folks to see and places to go. Well, Buster flew whilst Hired took a little snoog with Walter and the captain. Well, Buster landed at the west, we call it Desmond, but they call it Des Moines, airport. We got a car for him to ride in. Headed out to see the last of the 6 remaining of the original 19 covered bridges of Madison County. Boy, don't you know sparkling's going on there. The tour was just 15 minutes from I-35, so there was time for other sightseeing before dark too, and there's places they wanted to see. Buster had it all lined out. Whilst they was driving, Buster gave the list to the captain to look over with Walter and Hired. Now there's all kinds of famous people, but the one everybody was going to know was John Wayne. And that's where the boys were going to go. And they decided to go to John Wayne's birthplace just to take a look around. Well, when they got there, a lady was in the house tidying up a bit and looking over some papers. Well, the captain walked over and began to speaking to her, and she just smiled a big old smile at the captain. She asked him if he if she could help him, and he said they was just there for a visit. Boy, howdy, them pheromones of Jesse's was kicking up a storm, because that there lady sure made eyes at the captain. Walter hollered over and said, "Captain, are we going to light for a spell? Because if we are, I'm going to look around for a bit." The lady looked at the captain in bewilderment, and he had to explain that the boy just called him captain, but his name was Jesse McBrayer. She said her name was Asa Wayne, and that John Wayne was her kin, in fact her pa. Well, after being introduced to the boys and visiting for a spell, she invited them to stay for the concert to remember her daddy, and she was going to give a talk. There'd be refreshments after the show, and they was welcome. Well, the boys just couldn't turn down that invite, and it wasn't that far back to the plane, but they figured they'd just spend the night, head out over in the next morning. It was a fine talk about her daddy, and the singing was real good too. Well, after the concert, they all sat around and talked over some punch and cookies and some little sandwiches they had. They didn't quite fill up Buster, though. Walter asked Miss Asa after most all the folks left on out if she'd like to have a little snort of Jesse's folks' old McBrayer. Well, she said sure enough, if Walter got some out of Hired's bag, he always brought with him. Well, they all got to talking about some of the things they done, and Miss Asa thought it was so exciting, especially how Jesse got to be called a captain. She also said that Mother Nature's gift of youth was the finest face cream ever made, and was right impressed that Jesse come up with the idea. Well, the captain said none of it could be done without all of them pitching in to make it so. It come up on the witching hour, and Miss Asa and her traveling companion was fixing to get ready for bed. Well, Miss Asa asked if the boys would like to stay the night and have breakfast with her in the next morning before they left on out. Well, that was another invite they had to take. Well, after breakfast the next morning, all of them headed for the airport, and when they got there, Buster asked if Miss Asa had anything to do for the next few days. Well, Miss Asa said she didn't, and there wasn't nothing much waiting for her to do back in Hollywood. You know, she was an actress and a lawyer, but didn't have nothing on her plate right then. Of course, that lawyer and Jesse went right along with each other. So the boys took Miss Asa and Miss Grace with them. And after the takeoff, Buster finally told them where they was a-going, to McBrayer Springs. They was going to visit Aunt Judith and Elizabeth and the ladies at the mansion. It was about time for them to do that, and now was as good a time as any. They'd be there about 3 hours and would refuel and eat a bite of dinner at Indianapolis, Indiana, then be into Mount Sterling in time for supper. Well, Hired called up Aunt Judith and told her they was a-coming and bringing guests and to make up the rooms. She said they just couldn't wait for them to get there, and Elizabeth Jane had lots to tell them about Europe. Well, after a quick sandwich and fueling up the Queen, Hired took over the flying, and Buster took to telling all manner of tales to the two ladies. That boy could talk too. Of course, I don't know about out-talking Walter, but he could do his fair share of it. Miss Asa and Miss Grace was just full of questions, and come to find out she knowed Mr. Factor and Nancy as well. She said she just loved that Nancy to death because she was the best in the business and the sweetest. She was in high demand for sure in the movie makeup business. Well, that brought on the story of Denver and Leonard Banks, and by the time of all Buster's tall tale telling, with Walter making it even worse, which that's for sure, the trickster, they was ready to land in Mount Sterling. Elizabeth Jane was there in the van to take them on back to McBrayer Springs. Well, after all the introducing was over, they got down to supper. Now, the ladies was right taken with Miss Asa being John Wayne's daughter-in-law, since he played in the movies with Maureen O'Hara. All about the Irish, you know. Well, everybody in the household sat down to supper and visited over a long and leisurely meal you couldn't buy for no amount of money. Well, in the parlor, over a snifter of old McBrayer, Aunt Judith told Miss Asa and Miss Grace of the story of how they all met and all the things that done happened to them. Of course, she had to leave out a lot about Mr. Holmes and Dalton and Devane, but got in the main parts about the McBrayers and the Tiptons being kin and all. Well, to say the least, all the women hit it off right from the start. They would be friends till they passed to the other side with Jesus and then some. In the future, all them women would be at the birthing, baptizing, marrying, and dying. Them women was plumb bonded. Well, Miss Asa told all of them to just to call her Asa instead of Miss Asa. She felt like they was all family and just weren't no need. Well, all of them just laughed at that and said they would. Goes without saying the boys and the folks was bonded like glue too, along with Mr. Holmes and Dalton and Devane. Well, all the folks had a history now and would always be that way for one another. They'd be there for them no matter what. Well, a bunch of them stayed on for 3 more days before they headed on out. The boys was going to decide which ones of the bunch was going to come back and help out and stay for a spell with Aunt Judith and Elizabeth Jane. There were some things that Jesse and Buster had to discuss, as well as Hired and Walter. All that would come up to be ciphered on over later. Now, the van was loaded up and ready to take the boys and Miss Asa and Miss Grace back to the airport. Now, every one of them women turned out on the waterworks, don't you know, and was a hugging and a wiping their eyes. Aunt Judith just wasn't going to let go of Jesse and Buster, and she made Walter hold still for his and hugging and a kissing with him a squirming. Hired one never run. Hired only got a little red face with them cheeks of his'n and just grinned like a possum eating green persimmons. They all promised to write and call and be back soon. Now, Asa invited Aunt Judith and Elizabeth and the ladies out to her place at Hollywood, and also to the ranch in Arizona, and if and when they had the time to stay a few days on the Wild Goose. That was Asa's daddy's boat. It was a Thursday, and it was a fine day for flying. Well, Hired took off on with the Queen and flew back to Hollywood and left off Asa and Miss Grace. They all said they couldn't stay, but would visit again soon and keep in touch. Now, Asa said she'd give their regards to Nancy and Mr. Factor too. Well, Buster flew for a spell towards the north. Now, just where in the dickens was he a-taking them now was the question. Buster said 2 words: Jim Rogers. Now, all the boys said in unison, heck yes. Well, Buster set the Queen down at the airport there in Sandpoint and rented a truck for him to go up to the mountain. Now, Buster done the driving, and they was there in about an hour. At the base of the mountain and near the entrance to the cave stood Jim and the wolf a-waiting for him. Said he seed them a-coming, was right proud to see them. He was a-wondering when they'd be back and was a-hoping it was real soon. They all went into the cave and got settled, and the captain broke out a bottle of old McBrayer for Jim and them to have a little taste whilst they was visiting. Well, Jesse had to tell Jim why they was calling him the captain all the time now, and that took a bit, and Jim said he reckoned it would be just Jesse if and that was all right. They all laughed at that, and Jesse told Jim they brung him a case of old McBrayer. It was in the truck. Buster had put 10 cases in the plane before they left, and knowed there was plenty where that come from. Jim said he sure enough was glad to get it, 'cause it took the chill off of him in the cold evenings. The wolf done found himself a gal, and Jim told them all to follow him. Now, down by the opening in the roof and back into the mountain was a lair, and a she-wolf with 6 pups. Now, Jim said to hold back now, and him and the wolf went up to the mama and the pups. She let Jim pick up a couple of them after she snipped him right smart. They was cute as they can be, and Jim said he named 4 of the pups after the boys. The other 2 he called Pete and Repeat, 'cause their markings was just the same like identical twins. Well, when you got to looking, you could tell why, 'cause he named each one after the boys. The biggest one was Buster, the littling Jesse. The one a-wandering everywhere was Walter, and the one a-sniffing after every bug and critter around was Hired. Well, where old Pete went, Repeat went too. The boys all took to that, I tell you, and old Jim told him that they was kind of choked up all about that, you know. The boys decided to stay a few days with Jim and see to any needs he had and just spend some time with him. They hadn't seen him for a spell. He said he was studying on what to do with some of the gold he had and wanted the boys to take some back with them and do some good with it. Well, the boys all said how much they appreciated what he done for them, and that They had made a bit of money and took care of their families and future and took to donating to various charities. Most folks didn't know they done that, and they never talked about it too much except to each other or their folks, but they would be right glad to do what Jim wanted them to do. Well, first off, Jim wanted them to find out if his old partner had any kin that needed help. He knowed his partner shouldn't have done what he done, but in times like these, folks needed a helping hand sometime. Well, after that, he wanted to set up an Indian healing center that was for free to everybody that wanted natural healing like he done. The Indians sure enough helped him out over the years, and he wanted to give back some to them. Then he wanted to do for the Lord with what he was blessed with. He chose to live like he done and knowed the good Lord sent him the boys that he felt like was his and own. Real friends. The kind that was always a giving and stood by a feller. Last but not least, Jim had some real news. He done met up with a woman. She was a wandering in the mountains, a checking up on critters and what all was a growing in the forest when a puma attacked her. A mountain lion, that is. It just so happened that him and the wolf was close by and heard her hollering. Well, she managed to back up against a good-sized tree and was holding off the cat with a staff she had with her for walking. She was scratched up a mite and bleeding when old Jim and Wolf got there, and she was about played out. Wolf run off the cat and she fell out to the ground. Well, Jim carried her back to the cave and doctored her up, and then took her back down the mountain to her truck. He drove her into town to a doctor and waited till she come through all right, and then he left on out back to the mountain. Well, about 2 weeks later, the woman come back to where she was attacked and was looking for the man that had helped her. She hollered for Jim and looked for about a week for him. She made a campsite there, and while she was there, went about her studying on the plants and the animals. She was writing and taking notes and pictures as well. Well, Jim said he watched all this for several days and just didn't rightly know why, but went down the mountain and went up to the woman and said it was him and she was a-looking for her. Well, they began to talking, and he just didn't want to come out and tell her about his and cave and gold and all, and she didn't ask too many questions neither. She just wanted to thank him for saving her and get any information about the area because she was a conservationist and consulted with the government and taught at the Boise State University. She had degrees in botany and zoology and was a PhD doctor. Now that all went right over Jim's head, but he got the drift. Mining was real big now for gold, especially in other minerals and coal. This forest was protected, and companies wanted to come in and mine and put in roads. She felt like it would devastate the forest and it would recover. So she was there to make sure that didn't happen. She had time off to do her study of the area and document the impact on the natural resources of the mountains and the forest. Well, she was also visiting local Indian tribes in the area to get their views about it all and see if their representatives was for letting the big companies in or not. Of course, the Indians, they didn't want nobody in there except them, neither, but some of the younger ones just wanted money no matter how they got it. And one thing was that the government was going to sell off a portion of the land, and part of that was Jim's mountain. Well, Jim wanted the boys to see to it that it got bought by him and see if they knowed somebody to help him in politics. Well, Jim said the woman's name was Marion Anderson, and she was a friend and a colleague of Molly Beatty. Now, this lady Molly Beatty was the first woman to head up the United States Fish and Wildlife Service. She was a forester and conservationist, and she was, I guess, an idol of Marion Anderson's. Well, to recognize her extraordinary work in the field of conservation, let me get that right here, Congress named a wilderness area in Alaska's Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in her honor. Well, Marion had her own credentials, but shunned the limelight, so to speak. She was right pretty and didn't use a lot of war paint, as Jim put it. She had folks, she said, but never found the right man and stayed by herself mostly, and because of her work didn't have a lot of time for courting. She was right at home in the woods and preferred that as the city life, which was really good for Jim. She said she was going to semi-retire and find a place where she could work and be left alone. but was able to do what she needed to do in the world as well. She was trying, she said, but the demands was great and work was never done. Well, Jim said after a time they finally come to find out that they'd become fast friends. Jim told her some about himself. He said, but just didn't want to get into everything. Well, now Jim liked her right smart now, excuse me folks, and cottoned to her ways, and plus the wolf liked her okay too. He said it wasn't like with the boys, but just different. He wondered if they could all sit down and eat some supper when she come by one evening. She was off into her place in town and be back in a day or two. Well, all the boys said they'd hang around a bit because they wanted some fishing and swimming and just relaxing like a pig in the sunshine. In 2 days' time, Mary and Anderson come back to the mountain, and the boys got to meet her and was sure enough took to the lady. She was an awful pretty lady, and she sure had an effect on old Jim. Well, he cleaned up and shaved and put on his good buckskins the Indians made for him. He even spit-shined his boots, bear grease and all. Boy, it smelled. He done give Wolf a bath too with some shampoo Buster had with him, and Wolf smelled right good too. Well, I let Jim know that the shampoo was organic so not to hurt Wolf's natural oils in his coat, and to not never use nothing else or it might hurt him in the long run. Well, Wolf kind of took to that bathing and liked being scrubbed in the warm water that Jim heated up for his washing. Well, Mama Wolf let the boys come close, but wasn't going to leave them pups for a while, so Jim and his boys and the boys kept food close by for her as she was still nursing the pups. Now, it wasn't long though, for the way was all up and about. All them pups. Well, Mary had visited with the boys and Jim's for 3 days, and then she had to go back to the school and write up a report for the government. Sorry, the little pause there. I just had to kind of catch my hair here in a minute. She said she knowed what could be done about buying the land and what the government wanted for it, and there would be sealed bids took on it. She also knowed of mining companies that was going to pay a pretty penny for the land in their bid to get it. Well, Jessie asked about what it would take to buy the land, and she said that one of the mining companies was offering up to $150 billion, according to one of the secretaries that worked for him. When Marion left, the boys all got together and hashed out what had to be done to save the mountain. It was money, pure and simple. Well, Jim took them back to where he stashed his in gold, and boy, did he have a pile of it. It was in raw form and in sand-cast bars as Jim done it all himself. There was a stack of them bars, 6 foot tall and 20 foot long, in one of the tunnels. And each one of them bars weighed about 5 pounds. Jim had them bars end up like cordwood, but on a smaller scale since them bars weren't very big. There just wasn't no telling how many there was nor how much they was worth. Plus he had nuggets and ore too. Man, oh man, it was eye-popping. Now Jessie figured each bar had a conservative 90% pure gold, and each bar weighing in about 5 pounds. So that meant that there was about 72 ounces of gold per bar. With current gold prices of about $1,000 an ounce, it would take about 2,800 bars. Well, Jim asked the boys if they could get a trailer and haul it off to sell to buy the land, and if anything was left over to donate it to the things they talked about. Well, them 3,000 bars hardly made a dent in the stack Jim had, and he said he most generally added to it every week, depending on the vein and what all he got out of the stream in the cave. Well, that evening, the boys made up to leaving and taking care of Jim's business and would call Mary and ask her where to submit Jim's bid. Well, Jessie told Jim he'd get Mr. Green to help him with all the legal details and would pay him out of what was left over. Jim said he wanted a will to read that the boys and Marion owned the mountain jointly, and if anything ever happened to him, they'd get it. The gold would be theirs, as he said it would, and to take just enough of it for the few things he wanted done. But the most important thing was about telling Marion about all of his business, and with his head hung down low about asking her to marry up with him. But Jim said he wanted everything to be out front, and he wasn't going to move into no town. He sure didn't want anybody else to know where he was and what all he had. Well, all the boys said they understood his concerns, and if he didn't mind, they would have a heart-to-heart talk with Marion and would give him their feel for things about his feelings and whatnot. But they wanted Jim to know that they supported him in whatever he wanted to do. Well, up front, said Buster, it looked like a match made in heaven. Old Walter didn't say much about love and romance and such, but he told Jim that a man ought to have a woman. Well, that's how God made us. Howard said, just look at old Wolf, and he didn't like much of nothing or nobody. Well, Jesse told Jim them pheromones of his'n must have been rubbing off Jim cause of the way Marion looked at him all starry-eyed and all. But time would tell. It had only been about a year since Jim met Marion. Well, the boys loaded up and went to town, got a trailer that was enclosed, and Jesse called Mr. Green and made all the arrangements for the bid, donations to the charities. Heck, there was going to be about $20 million or so left over after buying the property. Well, Jesse and Mr. Green talked some. Jesse told the boys that they ought to buy a bank and make it private, a safekeeping place for the gold, and have their own credit cards and back everything with gold, which no other bank was doing right now. Well, I think we've heard that somewhere before, haven't we? Well, Buster and Marion told Marion that they was going to stop by and see her for a little chat if she had time, and they didn't have supper if she was going to be in Sandport tomorrow. They'd like to have supper with her. They'd be glad to pick her up, but she had left her truck at the airport and would meet them at the Lighthouse restaurant there in Sandpoint. That's, I guess about 7 p.m., she said. Well, Jesse especially liked their salad dressing, and Buster and Walter and Howard could see wheels a-turning his and Hade about that dressing. When they all met up the next evening, Marion told the boys her feelings for Jim. She just had never met no man like Jim ever before. She had a serious hankering to be with a man, but she had another life other than just but she had another life other than just in the mountains. She felt that she had a duty to perform, but felt they could make it all work out. Well, Howard and Walter expressed their opinions real plain and said they didn't want Jim hurt none, but figured they ought to have an honest talk about their future. The boys was going to leave, but would stay over for another day or so if she wanted them to be there. They'd be glad to get things started in discussing matters and then leave them alone to work out what they needed to do. Well, they all headed on back to the campsite. Jim and Wolf come down from the mountain. He said he found the puma, and it was a she-cat with cubs, and that's why she was so ornery. The boys said they had some business to talk about, and Jim said to get on to it now. This here talk was to be up front and take it to the couch, as Buster's grandpa Gus always said. It was all going to be over and done with when they got up from their talk. Well, first off, Jesse gave a report on the bid for the land and what Mr. Green had done. Marion's jaw dropped plumb to the ground when she heard Jim put up $200 million for the mountain. She asked him where in the world he got that kind of money. Well, before he could speak up, Walter said they would discuss that in a minute or two. Jim looked at Walter with a grateful eye. He was kind of tongue-tied this evening. First thing was talked about was Marion's solemn word never to tell anybody what was going to be told her tonight. She allowed she would never tell nobody nothing, ever. Well, Howard was a petting Wolf when Marion said that she wanted to know where in the mountains Wolf and Jim was a-staying. Well, then Howard asked if and Jim wanted to tell her, and he said he reckoned so. So Jim told her about the secret entrance and all about it and how it come about. He said they'd go there after a bit. Well, Buster took the floor and told Jim and Marion they needed to work out a few things, and the boys were going to head on into the cave. Howard called for Wolf, and they all left. Now, Jim sputtered a bit and then told Marion how he felt, but he wasn't going to leave the mountain. She told Jim she loved him and what all she wanted to do with her life. Well, after all the personal stuff was said and done with, Jim took her hand and helped her up and kissed her real sweet-like with fire in his and soul now. Buster knowed all that 'cause he was just old peeping. Well, they all met up in the cave, and Walter poured them all a little snort of old McBrayer. And Jim said if he got the bed on the mountain, that it would be in their names, equal like if something happened to him, and that he could make the cave a lot nicer if she wanted to stay there with him. Then he took her back to where the gold bars was. She like to have plumb fell out right there. She sure enough needed a snort about then, I tell you. Then the story began to be told. It was getting on towards midnight, and everybody was still going strong. A couple of the pups was asleep in Hiram's lap, with Mama Wolf laying on one side and Wolf on the other, whilst Pete and Repeat was getting into everything. The other two pups was still in their bed asleep like they supposed to be. Well, after all the stories was told and Marion was satisfied with all her questions answered, Jim up and asked if Marion would marry up with him. She sure enough said yes, and then plans was made right then and there to marry up. Marion said to make the wedding simple, and they would fix up a place in the meadow below a waterfall she knowed about, and would get a preacher to come on out and do the ceremony. It would be short notice, and not more than a handful of her friends and folks would come. The boys would be there, of course. Well, Marion fixed it up so the wedding would be on the coming Sunday, well, take that back, Saturday afternoon, and then they would all head on back to the lighthouse for an early supper. The boys would stay over in Sandpoint, and Jim and Marion was going to stay the night at a beautiful bed and breakfast on the lake. Well, the next day, being Sunday and all, the boys and Jim and Marion met up at the little Christian church there in town for services. Well, after church, they all had a fine dinner, and everybody said their goodbyes, and the boys went to the airport to fly on out. Jim and Marion visited a little with her folks and left on out to the mountain after that. The boys was mighty proud that all four of them was best men for Jim and knowed he would be happy. Jim wasn't going to have to leave the mountain, but the boys just might see Jim and Marion on a trip sometime in the future and would leave the light on for them. Well, all of them kind of expected a knock on the door was coming. Well, Hired picked a ham radio outfit for them to have on the mountain for a wedding present, and left a note signed by all the boys wishing Jim and Marion all the happiness in the world. Well, after takeoff, Walter decided he wanted to stop at Crow Creek and see if he could find Juliet again. Why not? They had the time. Whilst they was in Vernal, Walter stopped by the Harley motorcycle shop. It was on the way out of town anyway, for it was all over and done with. 4 new motorcycles was bought, and Jesse and Buster had them each a trike, they called it, and Jesse was just a beaming like a shiny new penny. Well, Walter got him a big old touring cruiser, and Hired got the fastest one they had. They made it up with the owner to ship the bikes back home when they left, and then took off to enjoy the ride and see the country. It was a roundabout way to Crow Creek, but they got there through the dinosaur park. The boys had packed a lunch and put it all in the storage compartments on the 2 trikes of Jesse and Buster, and as they stopped for lunch at the BLM gate, and here come Julian. Now just that, don't that beat all, and take the cake too, said Jesse. Well, when Julian come up to him, Buster asked him how he knowed they was looking for him. Well, Julian said he'd always know when they wanted him, and that was all he had to say. He told the boys to enjoy the trip because it'd be the last one for a pretty good spell. Well, whoa! He also told Buster there was trouble a brewing, but to hold the line. And the rest of the boys were going to have to be there when evil come a-calling. Julian said he'd be there too with their friends. Well, Julian suggested to the boys to detour and stop in Savannah too. They all knowed what that meant, BB. Jesse was told to forget everything and just enjoy the trip, and told Walter and Hired to go on and marry up them 2 gals of theirs. Them gals were just right for them. Julian said to come back before they left, and the elders of the Snake Lodge wanted to purify themselves before they left out. Well, Julian walked on off up the mountain and said he'd know when they returned. The boys all said it was all kind of spooky, but liked old Julian. For the next few days, the boys rode the countryside on the motorcycles and had a high old time. They seed all kind of beautiful country and went into the surrounding states as well. It was a Friday about mid-morning when they drove up to the BLM gate and walked up the hill to the creek. Julian met 'em there and took 'em up the mountain where there was an ice-cold pool of water that he said come from the ice cave, and the snake lodge was set up there too. The boys stripped off to a loincloth he give each of 'em, had 'em follow him on into the lodge. All them same old men was there, but none of 'em looked at 'em funny like they done the first time they was there. The drums began to beat and the boys would sit on the first row again. Them rattlers appeared out of nowhere and was a slithering about all over the place. But they all held the line, and all of a sudden their Cheyenne dog soldier sashes was in their laps. Strange doings going on for sure, said Jesse. Well, Hired was keeping an eye out for them snakes, and Walter was all goggle-eyed taking it all in. Then old George Freebot was sitting there beside him too. Where and how he got there was a pure mystery, but the boys just sat there quiet like. Then the shaman and medicine man come over and blowed some smoke on them, and the dancers went into high gear of dancing. The fire pit roared and steam was made from pouring water over the hot glowing rocks. The boys got so hot and the air was so close they all like to have passed out. Then George says to look. A portal opened and a body could see into and through something like a mirror. Now all the boys was believers, not only in Jesus, but in the unusual things that they knowed happened to them, but this stuff took the cake. Some fellers was a-talking to George and Julian, and they was responding, but the boys couldn't hear none, but only could see 'em. They looked like humans, but there was something mighty different about 'em too. Well, after all that carrying on, the boys went into a sort of a dream state. Julian then gathered them up and led them to the pool of water and told them to dive in. And they all did. The water's so cold it took a body's breath away. You felt like you was going to give up the ghost when you hit the water, said Hired. Well, all the boys agreed to that for sure. When they come up and waded out the pool, the sun was a-shining bright and it was warm, and they all felt like $1,000,000, and their heads seemed like they was real clear. I reckon each of the boys had one of them epiphanies, because they each seemed to know their path in life to take. Well, Julian said when the time was right, they'd be visited by some friends of his'n and to go with them. He said not to ask no questions now, or then, just go. Julian said they were chosen and he was proud they come for him. He said he couldn't ask them to come and that they had to make the decision by themselves, each one individually. Well, the boys was all scratching their heads over the whole dang thing and told Walter he done it all, and all of them laughed about that. It was his fault. For some reason, Walter knowed they had to come back to Crow Creek. He just had that feeling, he said. The boys said that was all right, and if it wasn't meant to be, they wouldn't be there, strange or not. Well, Julian walked on off up the mountain, and before he was out of sight, told them to tell Leonard this time his time was coming real soon and not fight it. Well, reckon the next stop was Denver. Well, Hired flew into Denver after the boys all had their bikes shipped on home. They called up Leonard and Thomasina, answered the phone, and was tickled pink they was in town. She said to get on over there to the house and they was going to eat supper with them and that Leonard'd be back soon. Well, Leonard was there when the boys got there, and handshaking and hugging was done, and Thomasina said supper was going to be in half an hour. Leonard brought out the old McBrayer, and Hired passed on it as he was a-flying. They couldn't stay because they had to go to Savannah. They stopped for just a bit to deliver the message and say howdy whilst they was in the neighborhood. Well, all the boys thanked him for their sashes and told him how much they meant to him. Leonard said to thank Thomasina because it was her idea. She and some other Indian women handmade those for him and was glad to do it. They all sit a spell whilst the boys told the story and give Leonard the message. Walter told Leonard to just go with the flow when it all happened. It was sure enough strange, but especially them rattlers was spooky. Thomasina said she knowed exactly what it was and what it was all about, and she could not be in the lodge with the men as the women had their own rights. Well, they both said they appreciated her stopping by and all, and the boys told Thomasina how good the supper was, and told him to come see him sometime. Leonard said, by the way, there was going to be a stock split with Microsoft and they would all make a passel on that. Well, Leonard said they was doing well and Thomasina had some more news for him. She was going to have a baby. Well, they all was plumb tickled over that and told him to let them know what all was happening and to keep in touch. There was one other thing the message to Leonard from Julian said, before he disappeared. He said, Meturado. Meturado. Did they know what that meant? Well, Thomasina and Leonard both looked at each other and smiled. They said it meant black kettle in Cheyenne. They was a wondering if an old black kettle was the one to be on the lookout for to fetch Leonard to the lodge or some other reason. Only time would tell. On that note, the boys left back to the airport on the way to Savannah. She was about back to her old self, but still was a mite fragile, and she was almighty proud to see the boys, especially Jessie, of course. She told Jessie she about had it all put back together again and was feeling fine. You know we're talking about BB. She was going to Washington to see Mr. Holmes for a debriefing of sorts, and Dalton and Devane was going to be there. Jessie wanted her to know that he was there if she needed him, and not to relapse or something. Just don't do too much too soon. Them missions was hard on her body and mind, and she was always into something or the other. Well, Mr. Holmes was going to make her take some time off from the missions, but she just wasn't going to listen. Well, Jessie offered to take off from work and schooling and just spend time with her if and she would too. They had money, so they could travel or do anything else they wanted to do. Just let time take care of everything. This was a way to keep her out of the line of fire, for a while at least. But she said she had to get on back to it, but would take a month off if and Jessie wanted to go somewhere for a vacation for a bit. Jessie said he would like that very much, and she just needed to tell him when. Well, BB said after she come back from Washington that she could call and they could make plans then. That was easy enough, about time them pheromones done some good, Jessie said. Well, after visiting a bit, the boys left on out the next morning to the sand dunes in Glamis, California. Buster flew them into Yuma first to see his and cousin and Jessie's, Marvin Tipton. The boys went on over into Mexico with Marvin that evening and bought some doodads and some almond-flavored tequila for Buster's cooking and aperitif for sit-down suppers and guests, is what they called it. You couldn't buy that stuff in the States, so they stocked up on it for Buster. The name of it was Orandanes. Well, the next day the boys went over to the Yamaha dealership and bought 4 Yamaha 700 Raptors. They got the paddle wheels too, and Buster and Hired changed the pipes and air boxes and dynoed their engines. Them scooters would fly, even with Buster on it. Well, Buster took off on his'n and popped a wheelie in all 5 gears. Now Jessie was a mite afeard of the thing, but soon got the hang of it. He especially liked riding in the bowls of the high dunes. Well, Hired took the lead and Walter the rear, and the boys rode for 2.5 days, and all the way into Mexico. Well, Hired got pictures as he always done, and if it wasn't for a stone marker, a feller didn't know where he was, in the U.S. or Mexico. The boys sure had a heap of fun riding. The boys made a beeline for the Bahamas to visit after they had the 4-wheeler shipped back home and said their goodbyes to Marvin. That boy liked to eat better than Buster, and that was a wonder in itself. The Hungry Chef was the place to go for quantity and quality, and Marvin knowed the owners real well. When they got to Freeport, they found Nigel and told him they wanted to rent jet skis and to ride the next day. Nigel fixed it up for them to do that and parasail too. Nigel was real glad to see the boys and said life was treating them just fine there in the Bahamas. Again, all the boys had a whale of a time, but Jessie was plumb excited about riding that there jet ski. Hired even had Jessie doing some tricks on the thing and spinning around and such. Well, Jessie was so light he never was throwed when he done them 360-degree donuts. Well, come nightfall, it was all they could do to get Jessie off the darn thing. And he said he had to have one of them things to ride. It was so much fun. Well, Jesse told Buster and the boys that he was always so tied up with business and such, he plumb forgot about having fun. He was so glad Buster done fetched him for the trip. Well, after telling Nigel goodbye and thanking him for his help, Buster flew the boys on back to Charlotte, North Carolina. Buster's very own first cousin was living there and racing for NASCAR. He built them cars better than anybody and was even in the picture show The Days of Thunder. They all stayed at a hotel, seeing how Cecil didn't have enough room for them all. And them pallets was just too hard on a feller's back on the floor. Well, the next day Cecil took them to a race at Charlotte Motor Speedway and got them all into the pits. They met a bunch of drivers. Cecil had them come to a party that night and then back to the track to test a car or two the next day. When they got there, Cecil had it all fixed up so the boys could take a lap or two in a real 200-mile-an-hour race car. Now, Hired and Buster took to that driving fast like a duck to water, but Walter wasn't too keen on it, and Jesse never did drive fast. What the boys didn't know was Jesse wanted to, but just was too law-abiding. Well, when Cecil turned him loose in that Chevrolet and Jesse got the hang of it, he set a new track record for a lap. Well, all the boys just stared in disbelief at that, I tell you. Well, Buster asked Jesse why didn't he tell him he could drive like that and liked it too. Well, Jesse said to Buster and the boys, "You remember that Lamborghini, don't you?" Well, Walter told him he sure did. Well, Walter had a ball too and let it all out driving the race car. Buster told Cecil that they sure appreciated the driving lessons and the use of a $225,000 race car. Well, Cecil just laughed, said there was lots of them at his shop. Cost over $20 million a year to run a team. Wasn't cheap. While crossing Tennessee, Buster dropped down and had dinner with Cecil's mama, Mamie. Boy, that food was great. Jesse and her talked a bit about the Tiptons and the McBrayers being kin. Well, leaving Crossville, Buster headed for Jackman, Maine, and the Mountain View Resort. There they got outfitted for snowmobile riding and an ATV trail riding too. They went north a ways and a couple of days on the snowmobiles and then south for ATV trail riding. Each and every one of the boys had the greatest time of their lives doing things they always wanted to do. Now, Jesse was the one that got all into these outdoor sports. Not that he never wanted to do them. He was always just too preoccupied. Buster knew something had to break the mold, so to speak. This trip, Makin Time, was a make-or-break time in Jesse's life. This past week gave them all a good, tired, but fun feeling with the best of friends and thinking on the past and the future. They real nice places to stay and really good eating too. Sounds kind of corny, but corny ain't always bad. One thing is the spice of life was put back into the mix of their everyday lives, and each of them knowed they had to keep on doing things like this or they would be overwhelmed by the demands of the world. And there was a lot more important issues at hand here, I tell you. If and you couldn't take care of yourself, and not just with money, then you couldn't help the other feller none, including your family. Well, that evening, Hired and Buster was looking over the balcony and looking at the sunset whilst Jesse and Walter was packing up to leave in the morning. Well, Buster told Hired he wanted to do something for Walter that he always wanted to do and reckoned they would all enjoy it. He wanted to fly on up to Alaska and let Walter see the Aurora Borealis, the Northern Lights, and catch a fish or two and eat them fresh at the lodge. A guide surely could handle the four of them for a day or two, and they had the time. Well, Hired said that was a great idea, and when they took off the next morning, he headed for Fairbanks, Alaska. The Queen was running real smooth like, and they made it there with no trouble. The boys radioed ahead and got a room for 3 nights at the Aurora Borealis Lodge, and also planned for a guide to take them for some day trips. Well, they caught some fish and really enjoyed the big ones they caught and ate them on the riverbank and enjoyed the beauty of the Alaska wilderness. The first night was not too good because of the weather for the lights, and the second was much better but not as bright as they should be, the innkeeper told them, for the lights. But on the boys' third and last night, the Northern Lights lived up to their name and were spectacular. Walter was in hog heaven, I tell you. He told Buster he didn't know how much it meant to him, with Buster a-thinking of him this way. Danged if Walter didn't tear up a mite. It was really a moving, beautiful, spiritual experience. Just the four of them, and the Lord's hand of favor. God's own palette and brush give 'em this night for sure. The boys all agreed that they didn't know why they was blessed like they was, but was mighty thankful for all God done for 'em. They had a bright future, money, some wonderful folks and friends, and lived in a free country. The American dream is what they was a-living. Well, Howard took off before they left, and when they looked up, he was hightailing it back to the lodge with a huge polar bear chasing him. "Oh, no, not another bear," said Jesse. "That boy's going to get it if he keeps this up." Well, Howard took out a snowmobile and see the bear cub was struggling to get over a snowbank and stopped to help it. Well, that's when the mama come running at Howard. Well, Howard plumb put out over, that mama bear was plumb put out over Howard messing with her young'un. Got me tongue-tied. He'd mess with them critters. Well, Howard got back to the lodge at the head of the bear, and the boys went up to the balcony to see how all this would play out. Well, that old mama bear sniffed old Howard out and just wasn't going to leave till she taught Howard a thing or two about fooling with her cub. The innkeeper called the ranger, and he got the bear to leave finally, and the boys loaded up and went to the Queen for the trip back home. Well, the boys overstayed there 8 weeks by another 6 weeks, but that was okay too. It did take a few days of taking it easy to get back home. Little Annette and Alma May met Walter and Howard at Jesse's house, where all the folks were gathered up for a supper and to hear all about their travels. Well, Jesse said he really learned what was important to him and his family and his true friends. The rest of the boys all told of their take on the trip and what all it meant to them. One thing for sure was, the Lord was a solid part of their lives. Supper was so good, and it was so good to be home with family. But part of the family was the folks that was in them places they just come from. Buster allowed it was time for prayer. Ms. McBrayer told Jesse to lead it. Both Jesse's father and son did the praying that evening, with the heads bowed and arms round the other. All the folks joined hands and knowed that they was in the presence of the Lord. The next day, the boys showed off their motorcycles and four-wheelers they bought, plus the doodads for everybody. Howard and Walter got all the pictures developed and copies made for each of them. This was to be the last trip for a very long time, with all the boys together as life had its journey for each of them to take. Now, that's not to say they wasn't going to see one another, but just wasn't going to spend the time they doing what they just done with no demands on them. This was really the swan song of their youth and a new horizon of their adulthood. Well, about that time, Jesse and Howard jumped on their Raptors, and Howard said, "Do it, Jesse." Well, Jesse popped the clutch and did a wheelie out of the yard and up the road just a snorting his scooter. Well, all of them sure got a chuckle out of that for sure. Well, Howard done taught Jesse how to do a wheelie and showed the rest of them he could stay with the best of them too. Howard was a grinning and said he knowed he had it in him all the time. Right then, Walter and Buster jumped on their Raptors and lit out after Jesse. They didn't rightly know where Jesse was a-going, but they was a-follering anyway. The captain was leading the way. Well, folks, y'all have a blessed day. I hope you enjoyed that story. We got another one coming right behind it. And do believe that, I hope y'all do believe that I appreciate you watching and getting tongue-tied here. But again, just email me at busterandtheboys@yahoo.com, and I'll send you all the stories and all the pictures and all the research that we have if you'd like to have them. Again, have a blessed day. See y'all later. Bye now.